Welcome back. My name is Frank Perri, and we will be discussing red-collar crime and its relationship to intimate partners. And in this case, when we're talking about intimate partners, we're talking about, for example, husband and wife, or individuals that are intimately in a relationship. Let me get right into a case illustration. We'll look at Frederick Tokars. Frederick Tokars was an attorney in Georgia, and he was married to Sarah. They had two boys, young, under 5 years old at the time of this event. In this case, Frederick was engaging in the best way to describe it is trying to educate people who were criminals on how to hide their money, and also some types of tax fraud schemes. His wife, Sarah, discovered that he was engaging in this type of activity. Now, in addition to perhaps issues between Sarah and Frederick in their marriage, this was a major problem for Frederick. And in fact, he disclosed to another associate that Sarah knows too much and that he's going to have to do something about this. He then has a discussion with a criminal associate that he knows as Eddie Lawrence. And he said, Eddie, I'm going to give you $25,000 and you're going to have to kill Sarah because she just knows too much. And in fact, Frederick's worries were not unfounded because law enforcement indicated that Sarah was, quote, a ticking time bomb with what she knew about Frederick and what she could potentially do with that information if law enforcement found out about it. Now, Eddie, in questioning Frederick, said, well, what about the fact that this is the mother of your children? You're going to have her killed? And Frederick responded, they'll be all right. They're young, they'll get over it. Now, Eddie didn't have the courage to kill Sarah, so he subcontracted the kill to Curtis Rauer. Now, Frederick and the family, including Sarah, they had gone on vacation. At one point, Sarah came back home with the boys. While she was coming back home, and I believe it was at their home, Curtis hijacked Sarah and the boys. They were in the car. The boys were in the back seat. Curtis put a gun to Sarah's head and pulled the trigger. Eventually, Curtis starts talking about what he did, bragging about it, and he was supposed to be paid $5,000. At times, just even the promise to pay is enough to get an individual who may be desperate to kill somebody. The third parties who learned about what Curtis did went to law enforcement, and law enforcement was able to back into Curtis, then into Eddie Lawrence, and then finally to Frederick Tokars. And they, in fact, testified against Frederick. Let me go on now to another case of Nancy Siegel, who killed Jasper Jack Watkins. And it's quite ironic of how they met, in that Nancy tried to sell Jack a burial plot. They became romantically involved, at least that's what Jack thought, and Jack was several decades older than Nancy. Now, Jack thought that they were going to be getting married. Jack left his family, his friends, and during this period of time, Nancy went and stole his identity, credit card fraud, taking advantage of him financially. And Jack was at a place in his life that he was more mentally weak. During this period of time, Nancy was courting another man while she was still with Jack. Now, she wanted to get rid of Jack, but she didn't really know what to do initially. If she sent him back home, then the family would learn that Jack was taken advantage of financially. She only had one option left, and that was to kill him. She weakened them with sedatives, and then she engaged in strangulation. Jack was found stuffed in what one would characterize as a trunk, like a footlocker. Now, they initially could not identify who this person was, but through forensic, they were able to find his fingerprints that were still with military records. Why is that important? Well, that also led to the fact that because Jack had been dead for so many years, he was still collecting Social Security. They found out where his checks were being sent, which was at a post office box. Nancy would keep going, collecting the checks and making sure that it was her so that they can show a pattern that she was the one that was collecting the checks. They eventually confronted Nancy. And they said, "Where is Jack?" "Oh, Jack is fine. He's living in another place now, but I'm just taking care of his financial matters for him." They didn't know that he in fact was dead. They confronted her about this. And then, of course, she says, "Well, it's not the way you think it happened. I came home and I found him dead." Eventually, there was a trial and she was held accountable for the murder of Jack Watkins. But what's interesting here is that she just didn't take advantage of Jack Watkins. She took advantage of her friends financially, of her own children. In fact, in one of her prior marriages, when she was financially exploiting a husband, when the husband confronted her about what she was doing, she came after him with such force that he had to hide in a closet. Let's move on to our last case of Robert Petrick, who killed his wife, Janine Sutphen. Now, Janine knew that there was a problem in that she saw that her bank account was being embezzled. She would disclose her fears and her apprehensions of her husband to her colleagues. During this period of time, Robert was planning her demise. And what's really interesting, during this period of time, he was already courting another woman to be married to. There were certain evidence that was found. He was doing computer searches, the type of computer searches that could be used as evidence in a court of law. For example, searches such as "kill with your bare hands," words such as neck, snap, break. How does a body decompose? And there was a lake nearby, and he wanted to know how deep was that lake. You see, Janine was eventually found in the water, and she was wrapped in what would characterize as like sleeping bag or blankets and wrapped up, but they found her body. But what's interesting is that when a friend of Robert visited him in jail waiting for his trial, the friend had indicated that they were looking for Janine, and he said with great disdain, "They'll never find her." What does that represent? That represents that psychological risk factor that I was talking to you about earlier, the personality traits of narcissism, that they think that they're so good that they will never be caught. There are some common themes that we have between Robert and Nancy, and I think by now you should see what it is. These are predatory fraud offenders, as I had introduced to you when I first talked about red-collar crime. These are those classic predatory fraud offenders that target individuals, where even before they kill the person that they are with, they are already setting up the next victim. As you can see, when we strip away just the terminology, at the end of the day, what we have is domestic violence. We have a domestic homicide. And at times, we don't think that financial matters impact domestic violence, but they do. And it is a risk factor that we need to consider when we look at these kind of crimes. I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. This was a very sensitive topic that we went over, and we'll be looking at the topic in a more in-depth manner when we look at the question and answer segment. Stay tuned.
Frank, what are the difficulties in reducing red-collar intimate offenses?
When we're looking at red-collar crime and its relationship to intimate relationships, if we just strip away just some of the terminologies, at the end of the day, what we have is domestic violence. And in this case, we have a domestic homicide. And in my work, I have dealt with many different types of domestic violence and also domestic homicides. This has been my perception of where part of the problem lies. Often in relationships where there is turmoil, where there may be violence in general, the victim may be very accommodating in that, what do I mean? Not that they're accepting of it, but they don't necessarily believe that the escalation of violence can ever result in that they would die. They don't believe that the person they're with would actually kill them. They may be in a very violent relationship, but the way they rationalize it is that this is maybe domestic violence, but I would never think that I would be killed. We have another problem. It may be possible where there is no domestic violence that predates the homicide, where there would be those red flags that could perhaps warn somebody of what they may encounter. Because red collar offenders at times have a sense of indifference, people think that that sense of indifference means that everything is normal. But what's actually happening is that the victim's demise is being planned, so they may not even see it. So that makes it a very difficult situation to be in. So I think that's part of it. It's a partial explanation, but it is one that I've seen in my work.
How can someone mitigate being a victim of a red collar crime in an intimate relationship?
What I would share is this. I think any answer that I give is going to have a dissatisfying element about it. Because like the family, these are complicated situations, all right? What I would share is that if there is domestic violence, that needs to be broached. If the victim can remove themselves from that situation, they should. If necessarily, they may have to call law enforcement, and they should, all right? The problem is that often when you have children involved, at times, and I'll talk here about the women, they may not believe that they have a place to go. And as a result, they stay in these tumultuous relationships and they end up becoming victims. So what I would share is that if they can try to get themselves out of the situation, they should. That they should try to get counseling and help to help them recognize that their own well-being is being threatened, and to also help them psychologically to heal from domestic violence.
Now, what about people that may see some red flags but decide that the love and validation from their partner is worth it?
That's a great insight. But this is what I would share with you, and that is that we end up overvaluing words and not necessarily looking at people's behaviors. In that if the words don't mirror the behaviors and there's a disconnect, that's a problem. Victims need to look at the behaviors, and that's what's important. This is not to say or discount that words don't have value, but at the end of the day, what people do, or if they're putting you in a position of harm, or if they are hurting you, that is a problem that cannot be ignored, and that words are not enough. They're just not enough.
Thanks, Frank.